Red Script Studio presents Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series. Soul Art and Self-Discovery with Jocelyn Bates. Caution. The Trauma That Binds series contains mature subject matter that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Podcast Nation, and welcome back to another episode of the Trauma That Binds series. Today, we have the master yogi herself, Jocelyn Bates. Always interested in architecture, Jocelyn just helps people build home within themselves instead. So just one moment while I get Jocelyn on the line.
Hello.
Hi, Jocelyn.
You hear me?
I can hear you just fine, my dear. How are you?
Oh, good. Good. How's everything at your house?
Oh, there we are. Hi. Not too bad. Thank you so much for working with my schedule here. I do apologize again for all the reschedules, but here we are. We're ready to do it.
Yeah, I get it. Believe me. 100%.
Perfect. So why don't we just start off with you telling the listeners how we got connected there and a little about yourself and what you hope to accomplish today with our episode.
So, part of my story is one of grief and trauma, and it's been part of my journey to share my story. And that's kind of how I found you. Podcast. But it's to tell my story and to allow people to hear different facets of trauma. And in my life, I've been through a lot of traumas, but the most recent was grief. And I feel like each time I tell it, or each time I bring people into the experience of my trauma and grief, it's the opportunity for someone to know they're not alone. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And it's exactly and it's exactly what we do here at Red Script Studios with this podcast, right? And that's why I appreciated you reaching out. We had a great conversation with our consult there, and I'm just happy to be here right now.
Yeah. It's an interesting field of like human experiences, right?
Yeah, for sure. Now, in our past conversations, you mentioned you had some struggles as a teenager. Now, do you mind sharing some of those key moments of trauma you experienced and kind of how they shaped your path?
Oh, yeah. Well, so as a teenager, I got into a very domestic violence relationship at 15 with someone who was 21. And I was in and out of it for 5 years. And as a 15-year-old teenage girl, there's a lot of vulnerability there to kind of take on what people say to you, right? These are teenage girls. So the idea that I was in this relationship with someone who was 6 years older than me, and who he mentally, physically, psychologically abused me. And really, the psychological stuff sometimes I think was the worst, because I was at an age where I was kind of really into what it was like, how to feel things, right? How to be in this world, like how I affected other people. And some of his abuse was like, it hurt me, but he would also hurt himself, and I would watch, and then he would say things like, "This is what you do to people." And I think sometimes that was the worst stuff, because maybe as an older woman, it wouldn't bother me as much. I'd be like, whatever, like, own your own stuff, you know? But as a 15-year-old girl, I took that in a way that I had to decondition myself from that for many years. And it was a typical domestic violence situation where, he would leave, I would beg for him back, he'd come back, he'd leave, and it was like on and off. I would say probably, the typical with domestic violence is 7 times. A woman goes back 7 times. That's like an average number for women who go back into domestic violence. The only reason I know all these numbers is because eventually I ended up being a therapist for domestic violence shelters and sexual trauma. So I know all of the
all the statistics, right?
Yeah, now I know. But at the time I was 15, and he was like my first real boyfriend, I would guess. Yeah. I mean, I've had smaller little things. So yeah. And I think I was very wild and very emotional. teenager. I never did drugs or anything. And that's the one thing I can say about that relationship is I never got into, he did not allow me to drink or do any kind of drugs or anything. And I kind of took that as a rule. So I never got into that. But I think my parents think that I was a drug addict as a teenager because I was so emotionally like on a roller coaster all the time. And I used to have these fits. And some people have described these to me more recently. I used to have these fits of crying and laughing at the same time. And it was almost like I had so much emotion going on in me and I needed some kind of outlet for it. And so it would come out in these really long fits of like hours long of like crying and laughing and like not really understanding, like they just got meshed into each other. And so it was like me trying to express things, I think, if I look back at it now. But yeah, I remember one time I was like, this is insane. We went to go see the movie Nell, and something about that movie, like the Jodie Foster movie back in like, I guess the 90s. And I got into it. And when I left the movie, 4 hours later, we went to a diner. We're from New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. So everyone went to a diner at night in the 90s. And I was still crying and laughing and crying and laughing 4 hours later. And of course, when that would happen, being in the relationship I was, he would berate me over and over again, So, but that would make it worse, So after that night, I ended up going to a hypnotherapist because I was like, I have to stop this. I don't even know what it is, And she helped me a lot, actually. I stopped having those hours of like crazy emotions, but she wouldn't work with me any further because I don't have any memory of my childhood. And like what happened is when I was 7, my parents moved. We'd moved together to a different house, and that's when my memories start. So they start between 7 and 8. And so she wouldn't work with me. She said, you need to have a therapist. And at the time, the world of therapy is much different now than it was in the 90s. At the time, it was like, no, you're fine. You're not going to a therapist. You're perfectly okay. Like that. It was like a stigma, right? To go to a therapist in the 90s.
Right.
So funny that I ended up being a therapist for so many years.
Well, at least you turned in to be a good one. That's the only thing, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's funny. A lot of people go into therapy fields. I think they go to heal themselves. I didn't actually go. I ended up in the therapy field by accident because I was an artist and a creative, and I was going to be a rebirther out in California after I got my bachelor's. I was going to rebirth people, And my parents were horrified. So they're like, we'll pay for a master's, but come back here. And I was like, well, I don't want to go to a college. So I found an expressive art therapy college where like the classes are in circles on the floor and it's all about expression and art. And I did it because they were going to pay for it. And then I wouldn't have to worry about like paying for all of my living expenses as well. So it was like, okay, I'm going to do this for 2 years. But I think a lot of people go into therapy to heal themselves. And I'm not saying I didn't get healed by the process. I think it definitely healed me in a lot of ways. I don't think you're ever done healing. But yeah, when you go to a therapist, to go to somebody who has their feet on the ground and a good curiosity, not necessarily they know what you need, right?
Well, and especially a therapist who's been through it, right? I'm not a therapist whatsoever, but I tell my story to my other clients and podcast guests, and they appreciated it wholeheartedly and says that talking to me has helped them in so many ways, and I wholeheartedly appreciate that because I had never expected that would be the outcome of it. But you're right. In a sense, doing this podcast has helped me heal by healing others at the same time, and it's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, there's something to sharing stories.
Right?
Just going back to like what I said originally, there's something to sharing stories. It's like even if you're not in the room with someone sharing a story, it's like a piece of your energy is out there helping other people's energy, like just light up a little bit. And yeah. I have a little bit of a bone to pick with therapy for the most part. I have many friends who are therapists, having been, in therapy school. Like I have lots of friends who are therapists. But I have my bone to pick is I do soul art now, which is a little different. I was an expressive art therapist, intermodal, which is like working within the arts. And then that shift that happens from one art form to the next, one art modality. Like you might have a poem and then we might do an visual art piece on it. And then you might sing it or you might put some music to it, right? Each time you shift to the new modality is where the healing is. That's what intermodal is. And so I've worked in all the arts. And I now looking back as a soul art guide, I'm like, that was like art on lined paper. That was like I had defined boundaries and all this stuff. And now, like as a soul art guide, it's like very much like expression in a blank room or a blank canvas. It's like because you can bring in the spirituality and the soul and the all kinds of beautiful past lives, even maybe, right? Like you can go you can go deep. But yeah. So my thing with therapy is that I feel like there's often some kind of I know every therapist would say it's not true, but they're like a power dynamic because you're speaking to someone and the stories, like when we talk about sharing stories being healing, the stories are one-sided in a therapy relationship in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's just you sharing your story, someone sitting on a couch listening to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, I feel therapy can be wonderful, but you definitely have to find someone who's right for you. And I never actually, I only think I went to therapy. I never dealt with my relationship, that early on relationship. Years later, I actually went to therapy school and I got my master's and did everything that way. And then when I came back, I started going to a therapist to start to deal with some of that. But I found that she just kept asking me questions, and it was kind of the same questions over and over. And I was like, I feel like I've answered this.
I can understand that as well, because I way back about when I was 18, I tried to see a psychologist, therapist, and it was the same thing. It's just asking questions over and over again, giving me homework, not really working with me. And so we kind of just separated ways. But recently I just started therapy to, again, heal what I've been through, because I feel it's kind of hypocritical that trying to do this podcast and trying to help heal others, and I'm not quite healed myself, right? So, right. So I go to this therapist. She's very, very wonderful. And she reminds me a lot of you, my dear. And I love it.
I think, you know what? I just think the ratio of good to bad therapists is not equal. That's all. And I think it's like you have to get someone that gets you and that gets as curious as you get in your life. Like they have, not have the answers for you. That's one of the things when I think about the world, and like I said, I know a lot of good therapists. I know a lot. Most of them are arts therapists, just because that's what I went to school for. Right. But I know a lot of amazing arts therapists. But it's still, in the end, the most effective healings that I've had have been more on a spiritual level, more in the soul art, finding out about like human design, which is similar to an astrology thing, but it's a little bit different. And doing like the energy work, that's been the most healing for me. And that's me. Everyone has a different path to understanding themselves, understanding why they are the way they are, how things affected them, how to, change it or move it or shift it, No,
and exactly. Like everybody has their different path. Everybody kind of figures things out on their own, and more like everyone's on their own self-realization path, depending on where and what happened to them in their lives. Like, me, myself, I know I've been lost throughout my entire life. And now that I've started doing this podcast and I started getting more into philosophy, more specifically Hermeticism, I think we talked about that during our consult call. Yeah, it's just one of those things that you figure out things are not what they seem. What you think does actually matter.
Yeah. You start to see like the matrix. Like we have the matrix of the world we live in. We have the matrix of government. We have the matrix of family, right? We have the matrix of our past. And some things we don't want to change. And some things we're like, that's not working for me. But sometimes you don't even know. Like, I think that's something that therapy can be great for. Sometimes you don't even know that you're kind of in a matrix of an experience that's kind of replaying in your life, and you sometimes you just need to find the roots of it and just get. I always go back to that word, curious. Get really curious. Just get ask the questions for yourself and wonder. And it's so funny because I work with so many people with creativity and even people who write. And I just did a live event today for writing prompts. And it's so funny how we don't really expand our idea of curiosity and questions and until someone opens the door for that. And sometimes a therapist can be that person that opens that door of why, right? That like, well, what does that feel like? What does that taste like? What does that sound like? What memory does that bring up? What is it? Someone else can be that kind of sounding board to bring you deeper, to get curious. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it absolutely makes sense. And another thing that therapy is good for is getting words to feelings.
Mm.
Because,
Yes.
right? Because there's like me, myself, that's something that I have trouble with. And I think a lot of people have trouble with trying to put words to the exact feeling that they're feeling in that moment. And that's what makes it even more frustrating because somebody asks, oh, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, even though that's just what they say. Or if they're happy, if they're a different form of happy, they just say happy. Or if they're like depressed or extremely grieved, extremely depressed or whatnot, they just say I'm sad or whatever the situation may be. And I think therapy, or at least talking to someone who knows about it, can provide those words to put to those feelings.
Yeah, and we live in an interesting time too. I'm totally a Gen X girl, and I grew up without all the social media and everything else. And like a lot of people who are Gen X say their parents didn't teach them about emotions. My parents did none of that. But I had lots of friends who taught me like boundaries in life, and how to take care of myself. And now you go on like social media or something, and everyone they show their perfect life, or they show, they show like the good side.
Yeah.
So you start to feel like you're all alone if you're having a bad day. Like, am I the only one that's like not feeling this? Or, it's. I think we're kind of in a culture where when you're asked how, like I genuinely ask people like, how are you today, right? But for the most people, when they ask that, are not looking for the answer. They're ready to go on to the next question or the next person or the next thing. So we get used to and conditioned to say, I'm okay, I'm fine,
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I know in our previous conversation there, on top of what had happened in your teenage years, you had also lost your parents during the COVID pandemic. Now,
Yeah.
Now, I'm obviously that was when. Were you going through your master's, or were you fully fledged therapist at the time?
Yeah. So I did all of that in 2002. I was finished.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm totally Gen X.
Fair enough. So my question would be is, given what you know or knew at the time of your parents' passing, did your skill set that you have help you cope and process with it better than what you would expect?
I would say I have a lot of tools at my fingertips. Like I understand a lot of the tools to move through things, and I had the language for things that I was doing without thinking about it. Like for instance, I knew I was dissociating for the first 4 or 5 months afterwards. I knew that I completely checked out, and I also knew how to get myself back on board because I just knew little simple things to begin. Not that they did, much in the long run, but it got me back at least present. But really, I think I'm more, to be honest, I think what really helped me was more of my spiritual, and I'm not religious. I don't ascribe to one kind of spirituality or anything. Just my faith in something bigger. And my parents were very holistic, and they used to go to the Edgar Cayce conferences. Edgar Cayce, basically, we did all of this work from the Akashic Records, and if you've ever had castor oil, he's the one who made that so popular.
Oh, okay.
And so my mom was an aromatherapist and a Feldenkrais practitioner, and so they just my mom knew like human design and astrology, and I grew up with a spiritual understanding of and how to kind of tap into that when needed. And so I think that actually helped me more. I think, when you have grief like I had, all the existential questions come up. And it's almost like you look death in the face, and you start to get curious, and you start to go, okay. And if you, and I had a very spiritual backbone, one that I wasn't maybe tapping into right before that, but that came up and tapped me on the shoulder when it was time. And so whereas the therapy gave me the opportunity to write and draw, and I knew, like, one thing when I was dissociating, one thing I did was write every day. I got up every morning and I wrote every day, knowing, and some of the writing is just pitiful. It's just, it's like poor me stuff, but I needed to get it out, and I knew that. So I pushed myself to do those things. So I did. I created art almost every day and I drew every day. And I actually don't remember any of it. Like I said, I dissociated, but I do have the notebooks and the artwork. So I suppose one day I could go back in and be like, I wonder what I was doing that day. I don't know. I really dissociated. And then when I came back, it was actually through my mom, through like emails that I had to do for financial stuff. So yeah, I would say the therapy, while it gave me some tools to continue and not go completely down, gave me tools for things. And I have language for expression. But in the end, I think it really was the spiritual backbone that was the thing that helped me the most.
Yeah, I can absolutely understand that, especially when things start coming up and they and at sometimes they didn't make sense, but as things progress, they start connecting, making sense, and it's just like, yep, that's the spirit talking. We need to work with that.
Well, yeah, I had a really interesting. So I am an only child, and I lived with my parents in the house with my family. So it was totally unexpected. They died 7 days apart, and it was super traumatic. As you said, it was like during the COVID time. So I had no opportunity to advocate, to see them, to really do anything, and because it was like 7 days apart, I think when my mom died, I pretty much spent all of my energy to my dad, and then he died. And so it was such a shock. It was such a shock to everything in my system. And that's why I think it took so long. And I also had no closure. So, because I was kept away. And I mean, even at the point where I had both their bodies in the morgue or in the funeral home, and they were about to cremate, I said, can you please let me see their body? I'm not a gruesome person, but I knew from my own therapeutic past that I needed to see them because it happened so fast. Nothing was expected. And so I said, please let me see their bodies, or I'm not going to be able to get over this. Like, I need to be able to just at least have an image. And I didn't want the image, but I needed it. And even then they said, you're not allowed to. So I didn't have any closure. And I kept thinking that things were going to change. And, I mean, it's been 2.5 years, almost 3 years now. And I still have these moments where I'm like, oh, they're not on vacation. It's like, because I never had any kind of real closure. So it took me a while. And then when and of course my grief story is riddled with things that are maddening, especially when I went back and looked at medical records and stuff. Absolutely maddening what happened to them. And so I had all this anger, and it was righteous anger to this day, totally justified anger. Absolutely. So I had that too, but I'm not an angry person. I definitely moved towards sadness over anger. And so the first thing that brought me back after I was, dissociating is first thing I did was go for transcendental meditation. I got a mantra from a transcendental meditation center and started doing that twice a day. And then I started cold plunging. I don't know if you ever cold plunged.
Is that kind of like the ice bucket challenge?
Yeah. Like you go for like a certain amount of time into a cold shower.
Oh, okay,
like
a polar swim.
Yeah, but you do it every day.
Oh, jeez.
It's like the Wim Hof method, actually.
Oh, okay.
And I'll tell you what, so he actually came up with this method after his wife committed suicide. And he was really depressed. I believe his wife committed suicide. Or maybe she didn't. I don't remember. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. I forget, there was some kind of suicide situation with it. And he used that to wake his system up. And so I started, transcendental meditation twice a day and doing a cold plunge every morning just to like feel my body, right? Because I dissociated big time. I needed to start feeling my body. And that cold shower, man, that was like in the wintertime. That was cold. Probably not as cold as in Canada, but it was cold. It was really cold. And so I would do that every morning. And it would make you breathe. You'd have to breathe while you went into this cold plunge. And I would only do it for I'd do it for like half of a song, because it was enough to raise my, the chemicals and the ability to feel my body. And that was the first thing I did. And again, those both are rooted in spirituality. And then as things got further along, I had to go onto the computer all the time, because all these companies were calling me because they didn't have a will. They had nothing because they're 74 and very, very healthy. And so I had to constantly be on the phone with credit card people and finance people. And I'm an artist, So I was on my mom's email. And in my mom's email, she was really connected to this woman who does human design, who I had actually introduced her 2 years before. But I had let go of human design because I just became this unschooling mama who had all kinds of stuff going on. But she kept in touch with it. And so when I was in the email and I was really feeling like I needed to connect with my mom, I reached out to this woman and I said, I need to feel this connection to my mom. This is what happened. And I have no money because everything went to the lawyers and everything was stuck in kind of limbo at that point. And so, I said, but I need this. And she said, I feel like my mom was whispering into her ear, give it to her, because she did. She gave it to me. It was a 6-month heal your witch wound through human design. And it was like this group of women who every moon cycle they met. So like a new moon, full moon, and in between. And it used well, they call it quantum tapping, but it's really EFT. They just have their own way of doing it. And I was doing quantum tapping through the resiliency points on the body. And I healed a lot just by doing that. But it was my mom, and I was connected to her because she loved this stuff. So I started to feel a little bit better. And when I was done with that program, I wanted to continue on human design. So I went to another person who lives in Australia. I said, I love this program. I think I need it. I have no money because I still had everything tied up. It took 2 years to get everything untied. And she goes, you're in. Don't worry about it. I think that was my mom again. I'm pretty sure my mom was like, you need to give this to this girl. So she had me doing, so I did this abundance and purpose human design, very intensive. And from there, so if you understand human design, it's kind of taken from your birthday, birth time, birthplace. But it ties in both numerology, astrology, chakra system, Vedic astrology. It takes in tree of life, Kabbalah. So it's kind of like a mixture of all of these different systems. And I got to learn so much about myself and where I've been conditioned in life. So actually jumping into my human design, I got to actually jump into my past with my parents, because I got to question and look at and get curious of why I made certain choices in my life and why I felt certain ways, and maybe where that came from, looking at both my chart and my parents' chart at that time. So it was a beautiful almost mapping of my whole life over the course of that. I'd say maybe 9 months in total.
Oh, wow. It took 9 months.
Well, it was like 6 months for the witch wound. And there I worked intensely on just my feelings of being in the hospital, of being able to go to the hospital one time. It was like when my mom was dying, they let me in. They made sure to tell me that I wasn't really supposed to be there, but I could because my parents were both there. And she was dying. She died just an hour or two after I had gotten there. And they had brought my dad in, but he was like, in a wheelchair, and they had a plexiglass box around him with a door on it. And they wouldn't let him get up from sitting down. And they didn't tell him what was happening with my mom. They just wheeled him in, and it left him to me. And he couldn't hug her or kiss her or anything. And I remember at the moment he said, I can be angry, but I can't be sad. And he lost it. And he said, she's suffering. And that moment when he said that to me rang so many different times since that happened. One of the things I worked with in the quantum alignment and the human design witch wound work was that all through my life, my parents have not allowed me to be sad. They would prefer me to have been angry. right? Because they couldn't handle sadness. So I did a lot of work in those first 6 months just on emotions, specifically anger and sadness, and where they came from and how they were coming out, both at the hospital, at the care workers, at my parents even. My dad actually, my mom died. My dad had a release date, but he couldn't live without my mom. They had just had their 51st anniversary, and they got together right after my dad came back from Vietnam, where he was blown up. And so they just knew each other. Their families were neighbors and stuff, but they just knew each other. And so when I don't think he ever thought my mom would go first, and it was such a shock that day, his oxygen just plummeted, and then he started trying to take the masks off, and he said to me, "Well, this world is yours now. You need to go embrace it." And then he stopped answering my calls. And during COVID time, you couldn't get in touch with someone unless the hospital did it if they didn't want to answer. And even going back to when my mother died, they kicked both me and my dad out before she died, even though it was only 20 minutes later. They wouldn't let us stay. There was so much craziness that went on during that time. So he had decided, he went through a time when he said to me, this is your world now, stop calling me. And everything plummeted. They tried to, he was trying to take the oxygen mask off, but he was a veteran who was blown up, and he had a lot of PTSD, and they had restrained him to the bed so he wouldn't take his oxygen mask off, but he was losing it, and he was screaming. He was a big bear, 6'5" or 6'4", but a bear, a gentle teddy bear. But he was screaming and cursing, and the steroids that they had him on had him crazy. And I said, "Take him off the restraints." And they said, "No." I said, you have to take him off the restraints now. So, "Well, you're going to put him on hospice care then." So my dad kind of had me make the decision for him to go, because I couldn't let him be like that. And I knew what he wanted. So I had to deal with all of those feelings. I was mad at my dad for a while. I was like, "Why did you leave me?" And make me make this choice, right? I had to be the one. And a lot of my family dislikes me now because they think I killed him. So that happened. So that first 6 months in the witch wound was so much about sadness and anger for me. And I just tapped through it, and I worked through it, and I looked at my design and how I was conditioned to feel these things, how I felt them from others, where it came from in my life, which in a way is therapy work, except therapists don't usually use human design. I should put out a petition for therapists learning human design, because there's such a need for it in that field. Yeah, and then the second 3 months was really me going in to my own, really all these facets of deconditioning from my past. So the first one was more about those emotions particularly, and the second was really going into, what am I here for? I no longer have parents. I don't answer to anyone anymore. I'm the elder in my family, right? I have no one to answer for. Who am I now? Being an only child, you're always, for me, I had great parents. I always tried to do everything for them, right? And if they said, "Don't do that," I'd listen, even as an adult, which looking back, I'm like, that probably wasn't healthy. But, so I got in that last 3 months that I did it, I really dove deep into who am I? What is up? And I learned so many things in my human design about myself that made so much sense. All of a sudden, I was like, wow, I've hated myself for this piece of who I am because it's never been accepted by other people, but that's who I am. And I was able to accept it. It was amazing work. And I continue to work with my chart all the time. And it was just a really beautiful deconditioning process. I'm still deconditioning. I've been deconditioning. In human design, you decondition for at least 7 years. I've been deconditioning since before my parents died. But it's been intense for the last 2.5, 3 years. So that was where I went. That was about 9 months. I would say maybe that's almost 10 months after my parents had died. I was at that point. And then through the human design, they had a meditation one day. And the meditation was on the Akashic Records. They brought someone in to do a meditation to get into your own Akashic Records. And I'd never heard of Akashic. Do you know what Akashic Records are?
See, and I was actually going to ask you soon about the Akashic Records. And after a consult call I just had with a tarot reader and medium named Taiwana, now I know what Akashic Records are. In a certain sense, and it intrigued me, and our conversation was very invigorating because we're occultists, right? So it was kind of interesting. and then her guides, like her mom showed up. That's her guide as well as her mother there. Yeah, it was a very, very awesome conversation. But as one who is trained in Akashic Records, I was going to ask you kind of how it's done, your process, and how it when you found it, as you just had told me, and kind of go off of that, because that seems like a really interesting thing. It kind of delves deep into your spirituality there.
It's fascinating because I had never heard of the Akashic Records, and I'd been in a very spiritual place, but I'd never heard of them. And I did this meditation, and I don't know if you've ever had one of those dreams where someone who's gone has visited you. I've had them a lot personally myself. But when it's almost like lucid dreaming, when you're dreaming of someone who's gone and they visit you, it's like you can feel it. It's something within your skin bubbles up and you can feel it. And when I went into this Akashic Records meditation, I ended up in a past life, and it was as if I was being visited in a dream. It was as if I was lucid dreaming, but I was really awake. Like I could hear everything going on. I just had my eyes closed, and it was so different that I was like, "What is this?" Right? What just happened? It was a life in the '60s. I was not alive yet, but I was taking part in this life, and so I actually ended up calling this woman who ran it, and I said, "I just need to have a session with you because I got to know what I did. I don't understand it." It was very real. All the emotions washed through me from the past life, and they were not comfortable. It was actually highly about grief. It was losing twins while pregnant with them. And so I had all these uncomfortable feelings about it. She's okay, let's set up a session. And I set up a session, and she goes, "Oh, you're meant to be an Akashic Records guide." She's like, and I said, "I don't really have any money." She's like, "I think my mom was whispering again. Give it to her because that's what she did." And I was like, okay. And I did. And I learned so much about the Akashic. So the Akashic Records are like a realm of knowledge. They're a dimension of knowledge. It's just knowledge. You don't go to the Akashic Records to figure out what's going to happen. You go to the Akashic Records out of curiosity, out of wanting to know, out of knowledge, right? And because in the Akashic Records, I just explain it like time is not linear. Time, I like to think of it, and it's probably not the best way to do it, but I like to think of it as a crystal ball. Everything happening in like a really tight crystal ball. That's the time, right? You can kind of look at it from all sides. And when you go into the Akashic Records, you can tap into your past lives, your future lives, but everything's all happening at the same time. So you can't look ahead and say, well, what's going to happen? This is going to happen in 2 years or 3 months, right? That doesn't, because it all is happening at the same time. And in the Akashic Records, you basically you channel them. And you know what's funny is I went on a podcast recently talking about the Akashic Records, and she says, well, 5 different people have explained it 5 different ways. And I'm like, I know it's kind of strange because people all experience them different ways. Because you experience the Akashic Records through your clair abilities, through your presence in your body, right? And so some people might, like I have a lot of clairvoyance, so I'll see things very clearly. And a lot of people say, they want clairvoyance, and I'm always like, yeah, until you go into very violent past lives, and then it like haunts you sometimes. Like, not that fun. But some people can see it, and then other people can feel it in bodily sensations. Other people have smells that happen, or they can hear things happening. But when you're in the Akashic Records, when I learned it, and people have learned it different ways, you tunnel in through questioning and using your clair abilities, and so. It's a beautiful place to be is in the Akashic Records. Anytime you're in your own Akashic Records, which everybody has access to their own. I can't stand when Akashic Records guides out there say you can't access your own, because absolutely everybody has access to their own. Maybe they just don't, you shouldn't be accessing someone else's because there's an integrity that happens there. Like you have to have permission. There, it needs to be stated. You need to have full integrity with that. You're talking about their soul's knowledge, right? And in the Akashic Records, the knowledge of your soul, like from the very beginning, is there, from the time your soul was born. So every human life or life you've incarnated into, the knowledge is there for you. So I don't know if I'd said that earlier. And everything has an Akashic Record. The cats have Akashic Records, the dogs, blades of grass, events. You can go into an Akashic Record of an event or a business. You can go into the Akashic record of a relationship from your records, not necessarily from their records. You can go from your records, though. So there's so much information to be had, and people access it through their clair abilities. Some people walk people into their Akashic records through meditation, through guided meditation. Like, that's how I was walked in the first time. And it was really, really, I mean, it was so, I really had no idea what the Akashic records were at the time. So they're really cool. And, you know, when you go into the records, you might find that our souls make contracts before lifetimes. And you might find that you have a contract with somebody in your life, and someone who can work with the records can kind of transmute that contract. You could do it too. Transmute that contract so that it's not, the energy is not so strong. So, like, if I was to say it gently, if you were in a relationship, if you go into this life, right, you had a soul contract with someone to experience unconditional love, and you do that before you're incarnated into a human life, and then you're in the human life where you have free will. This is why we have free will, right? We can do what we want in this life. And that one person who you had that contract with took his free will and ran, or took her free will and ran, and is married with 3 kids and happily married, right? And you still have this like pang of like something's missing. You can find that unconditional love elsewhere. You just might have the energetic attachment or tether to that life. So you can just transmute it. It doesn't mean they won't come around or they won't be around you. I mean, I've cleared contracts with my kids, and they're still here. This is make it a little easier, you know.
Jocelyn and voodoo.
Yeah.
I know. But my...
Funny enough that you say that, because when I was in college, I worked for a store called The Magical Child, and I learned a lot about Haitian voodoo back then.
Oh, no, that's interesting. But my one question about the Akashic records is, can you, I don't know how to quite word this, let's say, accidentally dip into it while you're asleep?
Yeah, you know, the dimension of, like, we've all been in times when our dreams are somewhere real, right? And if I know I've dreamed of past lives, you know, you don't have to, but for the most part, if you're going into it to do something or to learn, you have to kind of be guided there. But in our dream state, you know, a lot of times we are accessing other dimensions. We are accessing other parts of ourselves. But, I would imagine you could easily access it through, sometimes people see it as a library. Sometimes people don't. But, yeah, you're definitely in those places when you sleep, if you're finding yourself in those lucid dreaming. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now, what would someone do if, let's say, they did a ward or spell or whatever you want to call it to stop that kind of stuff from happening? In my own personal experience, I've been connected with spirit because, like, what was happened throughout my life. So what happened to me was that I'd get like intuition, feelings, premonitions, this type of stuff, and then my dreams would almost feel like deja vu. They'd be almost like coming true. And then this one kind of put it over the edge. There was cop cars around my house. It put me into a severe state of panic. And then a couple of years later, it just turned out the cops were using our backyard as a sting to take out our neighbors for guns and drugs. So,
wow.
Yeah. So all I could see in the dream or the premonition was the cop cars, my nan at home, very distraught with these men with guns around the house. And so it was just like, what, why am I dreaming this? What is the meaning of this? And it put me into such a state that I think I put
anxiety.
And then I wanted obviously that to stop. And I think, what was it, rosemary oil on the back of the neck, or I did some sort of locking thing that would stop it from happening. And now I kind of wish I didn't. So I'm just wondering if there's any way to kind of counteract that.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. If you did it to yourself, I mean, honestly, and first of all, if you ever were in that position again, this is where I go back to the word curious. If you have something like that happens, you get really curious with it, and you close your eyes and you try to jump into it. You get the feelings of it, and you get curious and ask, and that's where you would use like clair abilities, get to know your yes, get to know your no. Like, so If I have a lot of clairsentiences too, where it's bodily sensations. And I know when I'm in the records, if I ask a question, I know when I get a yes, I feel an immediate expansion out, and I feel like a bunch of like, I can feel the tingles right up my head. And for a no, everything drops down to my like solar plexus. And it's a definite feeling. So you just got to know your yes or no. And you can go in, and if you were to have a dream like that or a vision like that, you just have to get curious. Should I be afraid of this? Is this something I can, prevent? Whatever you need to say for yourself, just so you don't have to get nervous and anxious like that. But having, if you stopped it for yourself, you just need to connect back in. There, and I think, so one of the other things, and I'm just going to speak this for a second, one of the other things that I did when I was and I'll come back to this, for grief, was about the second winter after my parents died, I had a massive swing of grief. I mean, it was like my kids had a sniffle and I thought they were going to die. I literally stood over them while they slept. And because I had such anxiety, I had insomnia. And because I had such insomnia, I had crazy anxiety. And because I had crazy anxiety, I didn't sleep for 2 days. And because I didn't sleep for 2 days, I couldn't keep a thought. And I started doing yoga nidra. And this thing saved my life. Yoga nidra guided meditation saved my life because I began to sleep again. And I began to sleep through the night. And I began to get into delta brainwave again. And just that alone began to get me even more. And at that point, I had done the Akashic Records training. And by doing all of this Yoga Nidra work, I began to expand my ability in the Akashic Records. Because in Yoga Nidra, it's not just a regular guided meditation. It actually works with the 5 subtle selves, or the koshas. So you're actually like softening into, the subtle self of the physical body, then the subtle self of the pranic body, the subtle self of the mental emotional body, the subtle self of the witness outside the body, and then the subtle self of the bliss state. And as you begin to do that, you become more intimate with who you are, your spirit, your soul. And it's an effortless practice, which is like the coolest thing ever. You're just laying there. So that, and I bring that up because that's something that really expanded my ability in the Akashic Records, because I got to be really present in my body. And I got to understand and build and get into an intimate relationship with the energy in my body. So what I would say to you is, if you feel like something like that's happening, the first thing I would do is really develop the intimacy with your human skin, right? The body that we're in, the soul, the body that our soul is in. Just really start to get into feeling through your subtle selves, through your layers, and begin by just so simple, like start to say, okay, what clair abilities do I have, and what's my yes and what's my no, and that will give you an opening to dive deeper in. You did not cut anything off. We all have access at all times to our Akashic Records. You can even just ask a guide to take you there if you wanted, but maybe if there was still if you know that there's a fear, right? If you know that anxiety came from that on some level, you're not allowing yourself to access it. So you also have to take into account the fact that even though you wish it was there, you might still have on some level, and want to not go there. Does that make sense?
Well, no, and yeah, it does, because let's say if like the anxiety stemmed from that situation happening, it's always going to be there, and I need to get over that to be able to get back into it or through it, type of thing.
I would never say get over. I don't think we ever get over anything. They're just pieces in our life. It's what I tend to do is say this is a human experiment. Like, I don't regret things. This is a human experiment. Like, we are all here to experience and experiment. So it's not like you have to get over anything. You just have to recognize it as an experience. And, keep moving. And it's going to be there, right? That anxiety might have like a little nudge inside your body. It might have a little claw in there somewhere. And, you're not going to get over it. It is what it is. But if you can develop the trust back with your body and listening to your body, and, to me, it sounds like a trust thing. Like, I would absolutely begin by working from the outward in. Does that make sense? Because it sounds like when you were doing it, you were inward out. It was like happening when maybe you weren't anticipating or looking for it. So it was kind of like inward out. So maybe if you start working from the outward in to soften those selves into a place that you're really present in your body.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are so many people that speak to the spells and the curses and that kind of thing. I believe and something you could play with too is banishing. The one thing I do is banish. I banish before every time I go into the records because I want to work with the highest. There's lots of spirits and stuff that work with us, spirit teams, and I work with ancestors. They're not all 100% for you. They're just like maybe the percentage of like of goodness. They're there for a reason, right? So I always banish so that no one's there that I'm working with that's under like 90% for me, right? So you could work in banishing a little bit, just like I got my kids in the habit of it because my daughter had awful nightmares. So we started banishing together before night so that she felt safe and that her energy was clear before she went to sleep. So if you feel like it's something outward as well, like you could definitely play with banishing.
Is that like smudging?
I love smudging. I love Palo Santo. But I actually do a mantra. I hereby evict, revoke access, rescind approval to all souls or beings who have access to my being and are not serving my highest and greatest good in all timelines, dimensions, and realities. All souls or beings who are not serving my highest and greatest good, get out now. All souls or beings who I've given approval to, consciously or unconsciously, who are not serving my highest and greatest good are hereby banned from my presence and my being in all timelines, dimensions, and realities. By my will, so it is. And I use that. My kids know it. Whenever they feel they need it. It's like it's a mantra that was channeled down from the Akashic Records.
Okay.
I definitely believe we have full free will and we are powerful. And when you take your, so you want to open that up again, right? You have to be clear and you have to be focused on exactly what you want. And when you do it, it's going to happen because we are powerful. We have divinity within us. We are powerful. We can tell someone to leave. We can get rid of the energy. We can say, get out now. And it's gone, So if you really want to, just focusing and channeling and really pushing that energy, almost like into the bottom of an ice cream cone, right? Like one of the sugar wafer ones, funneled down, right? And then really focused and clear, and then you can do whatever you want, and you definitely will get back to that place.
Well, that's perfect. I appreciate the advice. Thank you so much. No, you've also mentioned helping people find their authenticity and purpose in life. How would you guide someone in that process?
Well, so I work very intuitively. So it depends on what someone's coming to me for. So sometimes I'll go in the Akashic Records with them. A lot of times I do their human design chart because I think it just is helpful to know just some basics of you don't need to know the whole thing because that's down a deep dark, like I've been doing that for a long time. It's like, it's very intense when you get into it and it can get overwhelming, but just the simple stuff in a human design chart. Like, so for example, I have an open solar plexus and your solar plexus is your feelings. And I'd say some people have it defined and some people have it undefined. Mine's undefined, which means I don't have access to my feelings. I don't have a constant energy or access to my feelings on things. For the most part, people who have defined solar plexus always have access to their feelings. And if I'm around them, I will feel something, but it's not mine. And as a teenager, I will go back to that time that I was laughing and crying and laughing and crying and that was not mine. Right? If I had known that, if I had known, someone told me that I was feeling other people's stuff, then I think things would have been different. So there's little things about human design that can really change a life, and can just simple things that can help you find your purpose and your authenticity, right? So I will often do human design, just simple human design stuff for people, but I also will go into the Akashic Records, do intention-based yoga nidras for people where we really create an intention for their life, and then go ahead and I'll record a personalized yoga nidra for them to work on a effortless, subtle self level. But I also do soul art, and soul art is, to me, the most amazing work I've done. And it's really about, and intention is part of soul art, but soul art and creativity, and it's not just for artists, it's for everyone. Actually, I find people who are not inclined to do art have the most immense insights from it, because they just kind of allow and play within the art. Whereas someone who's an artist might already have they get a sense of what they want to create, and then they create it. They can't just let go into the process. Whereas someone who usually does stick figures, they're like, well, it's just going to be stick figures anyway, so I might as well play, right? But that the creative expression to me is the language of the soul. It's our soul speaking to us. It is our spirit speaking through us. And so a soul art journey gets intention. You get an intention for a journey, and that intention might be abundance or purpose or authenticity or a relationship or letting go of a job, whatever it be. And then you body map or energy map, and then creatively express on that paper or cloth or whatever you're working on. And then you work with that image to create an insight and a spirit action, which is something that's tangible that you can do in this world. And it's like taking a shamanic journey. It's like once you create that intention and you start your session in a soul art journey, you're putting your energy in just like you would in a shamanic journey. And it comes back to you when your spirit action's done. And I've done a lot of these, and people find a lot of insight and wisdom within themselves, which is beautiful, from journeys like this. So I might work a little bit of soul art, a little bit of writing, a little bit of human design, depending on what someone is looking for.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when it does come to your soul art, when it comes to somebody who's, let's say, who's not think of themselves as creative or as expressive, or let's say they only kind of, let's say, like myself, I'm a writer, I can't draw worth a crap. So what would you do in that instance? Would you just kind of turn like writings and stuff like that into like transmute them into songs and poetry and just keep it that way? Or would you try and make me draw something?
Make you. I find that often people come to me and I don't need to make them do anything. They're just, it is. So writing is a form of creative expression. And so if I knew that you were like, you liked to write and you felt free in your writing, if we were to create an intention and then maybe a body map, I would have you start with writing on your body map as your creativity door. I would have you start with writing. And then I would maybe bring in, maybe if you're uncomfortable with paints, I might bring in collage or, because if you look in magazines, there's lots of writing within a magazine, but you're not doing the writing, you're kind of pasting or cutting it, right? I might bring in different pieces of creative expression, but I would start you probably in that place of writing to open up the door.
Right.
And I have a little bit of a superpower in getting people to relax and let go and just have fun in the creative expression process. People never feel like they can't do anything around, and partly it's because I'll work alongside someone in my own vein. I'm an artist, and I've really never taken an art class. I'm a writer. I've never taken a writing class. I just really, I understand the process so well that it opens the door for people to just play. So, yeah. But that's like for a soul art journey. I mean, if you came to me, it sounds like you would be more interested in like the Akashic records and going into the records and finding some authenticity there. Like where, it's so interesting. About a year ago, I went to my teacher for a reading, an Akashic records reading, and she said, and she didn't know at the time that I was a therapist at one point for sexual trauma in teenage girls. And she had said, you have so many lives you have been traumatized sexually, you've been raped, you've been abused, you've been in power struggles, you've been a slave. Like, she's like, there's so many lives. And she says, in this life, it's like you're here to witness it from a different place, and you're here to like integrate all of that knowledge. And then I told her, like, it's so funny because I ended up as a therapist for people who are dealing with that, right, with specifically sexual trauma. And it's interesting the clarity you get around things when you understand kind of the long-term history that leads up to that, like outside of this life, right? I'm talking like past lives and stuff. The clarity and the sense of purpose you can get from understanding something like that. So, yeah.
Well, no, you're exactly right, because this quote always comes up into my mind when talking about like past and history, and is if you don't know your past, you won't have a future.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well, our past is a lot of how we've shaped where we are now. And we have so many, that's the beautiful thing about the Akashic records. To me, that when you're in there, it's limitless. It's a limitless place. And of course, there will be people, because you could go to one Akashic Records guide and then the next day to another one, and it'll be completely different type of reading, or it might be totally focused on something completely different. But I love the mindset. And I've done tarot cards for a long time. I started reading tarot cards when I was like 14.
Oh,
That's how
wow.
I got
Okay.
myself through college. Yeah, I got myself through college that way because I was like, that's how I made my money. And I love tarot cards and I love oracle cards, and I think I love the Jungian archetype in them, and I love the symbology. Like, I just think it's beautiful. But what I believe is when people, when you read a card, like say for someone, right, they're going to hear what they need to hear at that point. They're going to take out from what you said what makes sense to them, and they're going to get the information that they want, because it's like this magical moment that happened, right? And so the same with the Akashic Records, as a certain Akashic Records guide might pick out something, and the person who's hearing it will find what they want to find within that. And it's what they need in that moment, you know?
Well, and I think you're right, because as you stated that I might be interested in the Akashic Records, you're absolutely right, because as soon as I found out about it, it's been on my mind ever since, and it's been most revealed to me that I am now on a journey of piety and knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so the Akashic Records, I think, would be a good study.
Yeah. I mean, it's, and the other thing I like about the Akashic Records are it's, the book of life. So it's actually mentioned in like the Bible. It's mentioned in other religions. It's something that, has this beautiful history of being brought up many different times throughout humanity. And it's when I say it's limitless, and know that I've just, someone the other day had told me that someone had told them as an Akashic Records guide that you can't access your own. Everybody has access to their own. And if you are somebody that's clairvoyant, what happens is a lot of artists are clairvoyant, but they don't know it. And this is what happened to me in the beginning. I started to second guess everything I saw as being a big imagination. Because I was like, of course that just came to me. Like, I just had this thought the other day, or, whatever, that I had like these, I was like, I'm just creative, right? And it took my teacher like a month of like just constantly telling me, she's like, creative people are often clairvoyant. You mistake the creativity for what you're being shown. And so she started having me immediately, when something would come up, say it out loud, whether I liked it or not, or whether I agreed with it or not. I had to say it immediately out loud. So if you are like a creative person, I find that we second guess because we know we're creative, and you second guess the visions and the things that you see or hear or sense, right? So if anyone out there is going to begin to start trying to go into your own records, you could just go into a meditation and call in your guides and ask them to bring you there. But know that if you start to just randomly see things, if it happens fast and there's not much time for thought, it's not your imagination, that's your clairvoyance.
Sorry, just a lot. It's a lot of things going around in my head right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, that's what happens. I mean, there's a lot of creative people have high clairvoyance, and they just, or they'll get like the knowing, the immediate knowing. But what we do is we as a culture, we don't really respect the knowing, do we?
Well,
so we
yeah,
just,
because we want something tangible to believe.
Yeah, and it's not something that I always teach my kids. Now I teach them to follow their gut, but I have all their human design charts, and 2 of my kids are what's called, just like I am, it's called a sacral authority, which means we have an answer at any time. We just have to be asked yes or no questions. I have another kid who's a manifester, but she's an emotional authority. So she rides an emotional wave. So you can't really ask her yes or no questions when she's super high or super low. You have to find the middle ground. Sometimes it takes like a day to get an answer from her. So I teach them all how to respond to life according to their human design. And for me, that has been a game changer, just knowing your strategy and authority. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And if you're like a sacral person, it's immediate. Again, it goes back to that immediate. If you're like, say a creative person, the immediate responses, the knowings, all of that is, it's part of your clairability.
Well, and it's interesting because I had written a submission for the Alice Monroe Literacy Contest just prior to even starting this podcast. I had missed the date, so I eventually produced it as like part of the podcast episode, like the second episode halfway through. When I showed it to my mom for her to read, she read it and she's like, "This doesn't even sound like you." I'm like, "I know. I don't even know how I wrote this."
I did for about a few years ago. I was like, I just want to write a book. And I'm like, I need to write a book just to write a book. So I wrote a book and I wrote it in less than 3 months. It was done and out. And I don't know how I did it. I don't remember writing it. I look at passages and I'm like, I don't know what I was writing, but I can get into a space when I create of any kind. And it's hours go. And I would literally start with like, I have no idea where I'm going. And I just let my fingers type. And then I'd just be like, all of a sudden, one thing would lead to the next thing, lead to the next thing. And then I'd find out that that next thing that I wrote went all the way back and made a connection to something that I would never even have thought of. And the whole book kind of went like that. It's like sometimes we are channels, and writers oftentimes automatically write. They don't realize it, but they do. One of the really cool things you can do in the records, in the Akashic records, you have mentors, masters, and ascending masters. You have angels, guides, guardians, and you can tap into masters. Masters are like, so oftentimes when I write, I like a nice nin, and I'll tap into her energy, and I'll work with her energy. I'll ask her to come and work with me and automatically write with me while I have my ideas on the page. So you can actually work with writers or artists that you find to be inspirational, and you can open your records and start automatically writing with them. And it's so much fun. It's so much fun. So that's if you were to go into the world opens in a lot of ways when you start to, kind of get curious in there.
Well, and then it just goes back to the kind of cliche adage, knowledge is power.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like I said, like when you're in the records, you can't predict. It's not a place to predict. It's not a place to be a medium. It's a place to use your clair abilities and find out information and be curious. And I always go back to curiosity. I just did a thing the other day and I was talking about what are the pillars of leading your life. And I was thinking intention has to be one, because we can do anything. But if we have intention, like you could literally take a walk. But if you place the intention before you take that walk to find a new idea or to do something, right? Or to be aware or get curious about something, and then you take the walk, it's a different experience, right? So if we start to harness intention in a beautiful way, in a curious, beautiful way, right? Even the simplest things can be beautiful manifestations for you. So intention has to be one. Curiosity, 100%. It goes with intention. We want to get curious. Like we are literally souls living in these human bodies that are here to feel everything. When you get curious, even in the hardest things you feel, right? You can still be, oh wow, as a human, what is this like? What is this? What is this, right? And it's okay because this is the experiment. So getting curious, really wanting to know, wanting to and I'm a 4-1 in human design. So I'm all about that one line, which is research, research, research. I'm so into human behavior. But just, and really it's a beautiful place to be. So get curious. And then the other thing is creativity. And I think that's because we are the only species on this planet that can utilize creativity the way we do. It's our birthright. It's our birthright to be creative. Unfortunately, we live in society where public schools kill that in many ways, on top of critical thinking in a lot of ways too. And we live in a place where everything is external rules, fitting inside boxes, fitting inside, trying to sell yourself a certain way, not being necessarily authentic, right? It's all about this outward stuff. And it kind of kills our creativity. So I think we have to tap back into creativity. However you do it. It could be gardening, right? Could be a good conversation is creative. It's tapping into your creativity. And so creativity is a really important thing. It's how our soul speaks. It's our unique essence in this life is how we speak with creativity and or express, or how we have a relationship with creativity. So those are my pillars lately. And you know what? I change from time to time, but right now, that's where I'm at right now. I guess if I had to add another one, I would say would be a physical relationship with the body, because we are in this human body. And like I said, I do yoga nidras all the time because it balances the nervous system. And I like I said, when I had, you get to a certain point of grief, and then you think you're good, and then something comes up, and then you're not, and then you think you're good, then you are. It's like this constant, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to have it all my life. So I try to keep my nervous system balanced. I try to continue finding my inner refuge. And that's a piece of Yoga Nidra where it's your place of safety and security, that the more you visit it in a Yoga Nidra, the more it's here in your real life. So I try to keep very balanced. So if you can develop a relationship with your body where you understand what it's telling you and how to work within it, through a practice of meditation or Yoga Nidra or whatever you do, maybe it's cold plunges, right? Which was mine for a long time.
Right.
Whatever it be, if you can develop that relationship so that you are in conversation with your body and not always yelling with your body, right? Back and forth. It's like, the bad marriage. You want a good marriage. If you could do that on top of intention, curiosity, and creativity, I think you're in a really good freaking place.
No, you're absolutely right, my dear. And unfortunately, we are getting to the end of our session, so maybe just a couple more quick questions, and then I'll have to let you go because I know you also have a busy day ahead of you. So, now, with what's going on with you, what are your aspirations for work in the future? What are you planning to do?
Oh, well, I actually was working on a grief book before my parents died. And unfortunately, what was crazy, about 3 weeks before my parents died, I had said, I had lost a lot of people in my life. And I'd said to my friend, this grief thing is hard. And I said, if my parents ever died, I could never survive it. And then 3 weeks later, they died together, which was like totally unexpected. You get these things through life, right? You get these little. My mother, a few weeks before it, was like, in case me and your father die together, which is like, what? She's like, I need you to see the paperwork. And I was like, it wasn't really paperwork because they didn't have any will or anything, but all these things had happened, right? So I had this grief book that I let go of. I still did writing and all this stuff, but I'm really feeling the calling to write it now and to start over. So much so that I got rid of everything that I did originally, because I'm a different person now, and I just have things on like file on my computer. And I think in the nearer future, I'm gonna do that book. It's like writing an art, and I think the grief journey. I think that's something in the nearer future. But I love soul art and soul sessions for people. I love that work.
Oh, that's perfect. I'm glad that you're going to restart that book and get it out there. And hopefully you'll turn it into an audio book.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Right? Now, finally, my dear, where can listeners connect with you online, learn more about you, and any upcoming events you may have?
Yeah, well, I'm on Insight Timer if you're interested at all in Yoga Nidras. You just have to look me up. It's under Jocelyn Bates. And I do live events on there. Like I just finished a creative writing prompt live event this morning, and I'm actually going through my story of grief on Insight Timer through transformation next week sometime. But I also have all kinds of free Yoga Nidras there. I have like an inner refuge Yoga Nidra. I have a rotation of consciousness, some breath work to balance the nervous system. And that's free. So I have that out there. And then my website is jocelynbates.net, which is getting an upgrade hopefully today. When you're an artist, it's the worst because I'm like, I have to make every little change. But that's jocelynbates.net. And I'm on Substack under the same name. Yeah, so you can find me in all of those places.
That's awesome, my dear. Perfect. And like I told you, I think on the consult call, we're going to keep in touch. Well, mainly just to get updates for this episode here, but also because of the studio T-shirt that we're going to make for you and ship out.
Awesome.
Right?
Sounds good.
So you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon, okay?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. You have been very accommodating through the schedule. This conversation has been amazing, and you are amazing, my dear. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Perfect. So we'll talk soon, okay?
Right, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye now. And that was the very lovely and remarkable Jocelyn Bates. If you want to know more about Jocelyn or talk with her yourself, you can find her on Facebook or her own website, www.jocelynbates.net. This has been Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series, Soul Art and Self-Discovery with Jocelyn Bates. Production copyright 2024 by Tim Douglas, proprietor of Red Script Studios. All rights reserved. If you love what we do, please support our cast by donating, becoming a patron, or by purchasing studio merchandise. Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series is a nonprofit division of Red Script Studios. If you have a story you would like shared, consider reaching out to the studio. We would love to connect. Until next time.